the Socialist and Marxist Studies Luncheon Series. A series named after an academic minor on campus, Marxist and Social Studies. It's sponsored by that minor, also by the Maine Peace Action Committee, the Division of Student Affairs, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Before I start, the Maine Citizens for Clean Elections is looking for volunteers. There's a little leaflet that goes with this that explains what they're all about, and if anybody's interested in volunteering or getting information from them, I'll just pass this clipboard around and add a name to it. Next week in our series, I'll just mention before we start, we have a panel discussion with Karen Mary's daughter, who's a UMaine alumna and member of 350 Maine investment team, and Eric Collins, a graduate student here at the University of Maine, a member of the Maine Peace Action Committee. Sitting here, they're going to be speaking on fossil fuel divestment at the University of Maine. Perhaps, Eric, if you want to speak to him afterwards, and give you a little bit more on what that's going to be. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Nicholas Carnes, who is a professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He's co-director of the Research Triangle chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network, which is the principal sponsor for him coming to Maine. We have a Scholar Strategy Network chapter here in Maine with about 20 academics from all over the state. And the Scholar Strategy Network aims to bring the research of scholars to bear on public policy, to put research into easily accessible form, op-eds, short fact sheets, can be given to legislators and policymakers of all kinds. So Nick is coming to us from the Research Triangle chapter, where he's the co-director. His research focuses on U.S. politics, legislative decision-making, representation, social class, economic inequality, and state and local politics. He has a forthcoming book, which I think he'll be telling us a little bit about today, called White-Collar Government, The Hidden Role of Class in Economic Policymaking, which examines how the shortage of people from the working class in American legislatures skews the policymaking process towards outcomes that are more in line with the upper class's economic interests. He's also begun work on factors that discourage working class citizens from holding political office, and programs that could help to address long-standing inequalities in the class composition of American policymaking institutions. I'll just mention that the event is co-sponsored by quite a number of groups, including College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Departments of Political Science, Sociology, Bureau of Labor Education, the Community, the Organization of Food and Medicine, the Maine People's Resource Center, and the Eastern Maine Labor Council, in addition to the Scholars Strategy. Very happy to introduce you.
Please. Did you announce about John Nichols on Friday?
No. Of interest also, on the theme of money and politics, is John Nichols, who will be speaking in Bangor tomorrow at 5:30 at the Brick Street Church. So check that out if you have time. So please welcome Nicholas Carnes.
Really happy to be here, really grateful to all the sponsors, especially Scholar Strategy Network, which has gotten me to Maine for the first time in my life, and I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about the fact that all of us live in a country where we're governed primarily by wealthy, white-collar professionals. Like most citizens in advanced democracies, we live in a country where, by and large, the people in our political institutions are richer than we are. They're more likely to have college degrees, and they're more likely to come from white-collar jobs. So if you look at the occupational makeup of the country as a whole, the percentage of people from working-class jobs, and for the time being, I'm going to define working-class jobs are manual labor jobs and service industry jobs. So maybe a narrower definition than some people would use. Just looking at those types of jobs, citizens from working class jobs make up a little over half of the American labor market. Even in the 21st century, we're still fundamentally a working class country. If you were to look, however, at our policy-making institutions, they look really different from the citizens they represent. So the average city council nationwide is about 9% working class people. The average state legislature is less than 5% working class people. A typical member of Congress spent less than 2% of his or her pre-congressional career doing the kinds of jobs that most Americans go to every morning. On the Supreme Court, no one had a working class job. They're all Ivy League educated lawyers. And at least since World War II, no one from the working class has gone on to become president of the United States. And this is sort of the picture we get if we look at occupational data, but you see a very similar pattern if you look at, say, educational data. So these are the percentage of people who don't have college degrees. Or if you look at data on wealth, these are the percentage of people who aren't millionaires. So this is just to say that if millionaires were a political party, that party would make up, it's actually about 3 to 5% of the country. So the millionaires party would be about 3% of the electorate. But it would have a majority in the US House, a filibuster-proof supermajority in the US Senate. The millionaires party would have a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court and a man in the White House. So if the millionaires party ever gets its act together, watch out, they've got all 3 branches of government. And these kinds of patterns actually aren't anything new. So right now Congress is less than 2% working class. In 1901, Congress was less than 2% working class. And every year between then and now, Congress has never been more than 2% people who got into politics from working class jobs. Even during the last few decades, when we started to make progress towards breaking the glass ceiling for other historically underrepresented groups. So even as we've started to see encouraging increases in the percentage of women in Congress, the percentage of racial and ethnic minorities in Congress, the percentage of people from the working class is still basically on the floor, still basically as low as it can be. And this isn't going to change by itself. This isn't a problem that's going to go away on its own. If we do nothing, the percentage of people from the working class in our political institutions is going to stay where it is now. So one way we can sort of get a handle on this is we can look at state legislatures. State legislatures sort of, demographic changes at the state level tend to foreshadow demographic changes in higher offices. So a lot of today's state legislators are tomorrow's members of Congress. And if you go back to 1976, at that point, our state legislatures were about 8% women, about 5% working class. Fast forward to just a few years ago, and we see significant progress. We're halfway there. We have a quarter of all state legislators are women. So we made some progress on the gender front. But actually, the working class is losing ground in our state legislatures. It's unclear whether that's really a decrease or whether you just can't fall off the floor. But what we're seeing here is basically if we do nothing, the percentage we can expect Congress not to change much. We can expect more government by the millionaires, and if we do nothing. So in the first part of my research life, for basically the last 8 years, I was really interested in the question of whether all of this matters. So does it really affect public policy that we have so few working class Americans getting into political institutions and so many millionaires? And so I wanted to know, does that actually affect public policy? There's sort of an old school of thought in American life that says, well, no, it doesn't matter who we elect. We all want the same things. A rising tide lifts all boats. What's good for General Motors is good for the U.S. and vice versa. During the founding, the Federalists argued vigorously that even if our constitutional system was taken over by aristocrats, we all want the same thing. So what's the harm in letting sort of business owners run the country? And so the first question I started researching was whether we should care at all that working class Americans are virtually absent of our policy-making institutions. And I sort of summarized all the research that I've done on this question of whether this matters in a book called White-Collar Government, which will be out later this month at the University of Chicago Press. And I just want to say 2 things about it. First, if you pre-order it now, it's only $12 on Amazon. And if you order now, you'll get it in time for Halloween. So if you, like me, have a 4-year-old, you've also got your costume taken care of. So this is white collar government. But basically what the book says is, yeah, it really matters that in the United States, rich people and white collar professionals staff our policy-making institutions. So one of the things that I do in the book is I look at how individual members of Congress vote on economic issues. And so if you take something like the Chamber of Commerce's voting scores. So every year, the Chamber of Commerce, America's largest business organization, chooses 10 to 12 roll call votes on important business legislation. And they give each member of Congress a score. 100 is you voted with business every single time on these bills. 0 is you never voted with business on any of these bills. And one of the exercises I do in white collar government is I just break members of Congress down into those who, before they were members of Congress, they did profit-oriented white-collar jobs. So these are people who, they own businesses, they were high-level business employees, they were technical professionals who function essentially like business owners. So they're entrepreneurs, or they were farm owners who didn't actually work the farm, they owned the farm. So various types of sort of profit-oriented professions. And I compare how those members of Congress vote to members who did sort of not-for-profit professions before coming to Congress. So they're still doing white-collar jobs, but these are jobs more like teacher or social worker. These are jobs like politician and staffer or military and law enforcement. And I compare those legislators to the ones who actually did working class jobs, the ones who are the most economically vulnerable. And I ask, are there real differences? So if we believe the argument that everybody wants the same thing and a rising tide lifts all boats, we shouldn't see legislators from different classes voting differently on economic issues. But if you're like me and you think that people from different classes have understandably different perspectives on the government's role in the economy, you would expect to see differences here. And when I looked at the data, that's exactly what I saw. So the legislators who worked in sort of profit-oriented professions, they tend to be the most conservative. And the legislators who had working class jobs, they tend to be the most liberal or the least sort of pro-business. And the legislators who are teachers and social workers tend to be on the progressive side too. But this is all just to say that like the rest of us, a politician's perspective, what they do in office, depends in part on what they did for a living before they got there. Now what I don't want to say here is these people are bad, or these people are evil. The business owners are doing something wrong. It's a conspiracy. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, part of an important feature of our political process is that we let our lawmakers use their own judgment sometimes. We expect them to sometimes do what they think is best. And when they look inward for guidance in those situations, who they are really matters. Politicians are people too, and just like the rest of us, politicians who have spent more time in working class jobs tend to be more pro-worker. Politicians who spend more time in sort of business-oriented jobs tend to be more pro-business. It doesn't mean either side is doing anything wrong, but it does mean that if we keep this category of politicians out of our political institutions, we can be sure that public policy is going to tilt in this direction, tilt in the conservative direction. And this is true whether we're sort of looking at the Chamber of Commerce's voting scale, or you can also look at the AFL-CIO's vote score. So the AFL-CIO does the same exercise. And here I flipped their scale around to keep it the same. So here a 0 means I always voted with the AFL-CIO, and 100 means I've always voted against the AFL-CIO. But you see the same basic pattern sort of regardless of whose voting scale you use. And in fact, the AFL-CIO has been computing these vote scores since the 70s. And if we go back to sort of the first time the AFL-CIO computed these vote scores, we see exactly the same types of social class differences. So this is just the gap between workers and sort of profit-oriented professionals and not-for-profit professionals. In every Congress since the AFL-CIO has been creating these vote scores. And sure enough, you see the same patterns sort of regardless of what year it is. Members of Congress from the working class are always the most pro-worker. members of Congress from business and from private sector professional backgrounds are always the most pro-business. So one of the other exercises I do in the books, I say, okay, individual members of Congress from different classes vote differently. Does this really affect public policy? Does this really have a measurable impact on the way people live their lives? And one of the exercises I do, which is, I think, pretty telling, is I try to simulate what would happen if the social class makeup of Congress were the same as the social class makeup of the country as a whole. So I take a high-profile economic policy, like the 2001 Bush tax cuts, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Bush tax cuts. But they're controversial because they sort of give small tax breaks for most Americans and enormous tax breaks for the very wealthiest Americans and for businesses. And so the question I ask is if we look at policies like this one, would they have passed a Congress that looked like the country as a whole? So I just, in reality, the Bush tax cuts passed with 62% of the floor vote in both chambers of Congress. I ask, what would happen if we just reweight the numbers? Kind of like if you run a survey and one group is underrepresented in your survey, so you count each person from that group as 1.2 cases or something. We have to reweight more aggressively when we're fixing Congress. So in my analysis, every lawyer in Congress, they don't get one vote, they get 1/25th of a vote, because there are 25 times too many of them, numerically speaking. And every member of Congress from the working class, they don't get one vote, they get 25 votes. So we're reweighting them. But if we reweight their votes in this fashion, or if we do sort of more complicated regression-based analysis, we get a very different outcome on the Bush tax cuts. We get somewhere between basically 30 and 35% of the vote. In fact, no one who spent a significant amount of time in the working class voted for the Bush tax cuts in Congress. And according to this kind of analysis, and this is, of course, we can't be sure what would really happen in a class-balanced Congress because there's never been one. But based on how members actually voted, it looks like we wouldn't get economic policies like the Bush tax cuts if the social class makeup of Congress were the same as the social class makeup of the country as a whole. Again, this isn't to say that you necessarily have to love or hate the Bush tax cuts, but it is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about economic policies like this one, that they exist in large part because there are almost no working class people in our political institutions. And you can see similar kinds of patterns. We sort of step out of the world of simulating how a legislature might behave. If we look at how legislatures at the state level actually behave, we see the same types of patterns. So one analysis I report in the book is I look at different state legislatures and I look at the percentage of the state legislature that consists of people from working class jobs. And I say, okay, if it really matters where a legislator comes from, we should see that the percentage of the state's total expenditures that are going to what the census defines as welfare, which isn't just welfare in the federal sense of the term, but it's also the census defines any social program that benefits economically disadvantaged people. If we look at the percentage of the state's budget that goes to welfare spending, or social safety net programs is probably more accurate here, it should be the case that states that have more legislators from the working class devote more of their resources to social safety net programs. And that's sort of exactly what we see. So there's a strong statistical relationship between how many people in your state legislature are working class people and how generous your state legislature is towards economically disadvantaged groups. Now, we would still have to extrapolate pretty aggressively to imagine sort of what a state legislature that had the same social class makeup as the whole country would do. And we don't ever see, even at the state level, a sort of 54% working class political institution. But the evidence is squarely in line with the idea that, yeah, it really matters who we elect. Who governs matters in this country. And all of this has real consequences for people's lives. So one of the last analyses I do in the book is I just look at same variable down here, the percentage of the state legislature that comes from the working class. And I say, can we see effects even for an outcome as important as economic inequality? So not just policy, we're now moving into the realm of people's lives. And if you look at, this is sort of one of many ways to measure economic inequality, the proportion of income that goes to the richest 10%. So do the richest 10% in your state take home half of the income, or just a third? Just a third of the income. And we see in states where working class people make up more of the state legislature, incomes are distributed more evenly. Now in states like Maine, where you actually have lots of working class people getting into your legislature, economic inequality is a lot lower. In states where there are no working class people in your state legislature, economic inequality is higher. This is all 8 years and lots of statistics and a very long way of saying, does the shortage of working class people in our political institutions matter? Yes. I spent 8 years saying this. So this was sort of the first leg of my research agenda, and like I said, all this research is summarized and elaborated in a lot greater detail in the book. But the thing that I'm really interested in now, the sort of obvious follow-up question for me is, okay, if it's so important that working class people aren't in our political institutions, why aren't they there in the first place? What's keeping working class people out? And so that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today. What I'm actually eager to hear your thoughts about is this new question that I'm working on of why are there so few working class people in our political institutions in the first place? The interesting thing to me is that political scientists actually don't have an answer. They don't even have the beginning of an answer. So we have really excellent literature on why there are so few women in political office. Some of my very favorite political science books and articles have asked, what's keeping women out of office and what can we do about it? And this research has actually led to real reforms, to programs that are on the ground today. We also have some good research on the shortage of racial and ethnic minorities in political office. So we have a handle on the question of why there are so few women, why there are so few racial and ethnic minorities. In contrast, my discipline has essentially no research on why there are so few working class people getting into political office. By my count, there are like 4 working papers out there right now. 3 of them are by Nick Carnes, so I don't believe them half the time. But as it stands, political science actually doesn't have much to say about this question of sort of what's keeping working people out of office. In fact, a lot of the research on other historically underrepresented groups has simply taken it as a given that white-collar professionals are the ones who are getting into our political institutions. So one of the things that scholars who study the shortage of women in office are really concerned about right now is the fact that there are so few women in the sort of professions from which politicians are disproportionately chosen. But the question I want to have is why do all of our politicians come from these sort of male-heavy white-collar jobs in the first place? And in the absence of any sort of good research on this question, what we're sort of left with is lots of speculation. So journalists and pundits and people I meet on the airplane will have lots of different sort of theories about this, but there's not really any good research to help us sort it out. So the argument the sort of 2 arguments I often hear, which are summarized here by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist William A. Henry III in the book In Defense of Elitism. I didn't even have to put the quote up. You could probably guess just based on the book. Sort of the category of explanations that I often hear when I talk to people in and around government are they're basically 2. So William Henry says, voters reject ordinary candidates who are ordinary like them in favor of sort of these white-collar professionals because white-collar professionals have character and competence, and that's what ordinary people lack. And I hear this argument not just in this book, but I mean people. When I get to talking to people at the airport, they tell me the same thing. And I see red, and I sort of recite my mantra: "You catch more flies with honey." And I don't cuss, and I calmly explain to them, "Well, I'm a political scientist, and I've actually tested these arguments. So this is where I've started in my research. So let's take this idea seriously. do voters actually prefer wealthy white-collar candidates? So rather than get mad, I'm a quantitative political scientist, so I don't get mad, I just well, I do get mad, but when I get mad, what do? Instinctively, I go to statistics. I say, okay, if this theory is right, that voters really prefer wealthy white-collar professionals, we should be able to see it in the data. So if we look at if we look at data on how much of a member of Congress's career they spent in working class jobs before they got into Congress. So this is somebody who 3/4 of their life they were doing blue collar jobs before they got into Congress. This is somebody who never worked a day in his or her life. Now this is somebody who never worked in a manual labor or service industry job. If it really is true that voters prefer wealthy white-collar candidates, then if we look at the vote margin that a member of Congress got in the last general election, there should be some sort of downward trend. It should be the case that if voters don't like working-class candidates, we should see a working-class vote penalty. We should see working-class people getting fewer votes in actual elections. Look at the data, we don't see it. This is what my statistics professors taught me, is a null relationship. There is essentially no correlation between the amount of time a member of Congress spent in working class jobs and how they perform in elections. If anything, there's a slight upward bend in the line. If anything, voters seem to slightly prefer a candidate who worked their way up, a candidate who's an underdog, a candidate who can relate to their job or their experiences. But at the very least, there doesn't seem to be a vote penalty for candidates from the working class. And this finding has been replicated in some really exciting experimental studies that a friend of mine, a colleague of mine named Meredith Saden, who's a PhD student at Princeton and who's currently studying at Berkeley, has done a series of field experiments where she's shown actual voters all over the country a hypothetical candidate. I think his name is Mike Swanson, don't quote me. She said, this is Mike Swanson. Here's a story about it. So issue positions, party, and Mike Swanson is a surgeon. And so she shows half the voters that. And the other half, selected at random, she showed the same exact biography, only in this one, Mike Swanson's a factory worker. And so the question is, if voters really don't like working class people, then when we change Dr. Swanson into Mike the factory worker, we should see a vote penalty. We should see voters less likely to say, yeah, I would vote for that person. Meredith doesn't see it. She sees what I see when I look at actual elections, which is that voters are just as likely to vote for Mike the factory worker as they are for Dr. Swanson. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, Nick, I'll grant you, maybe voters don't have like some ingrained prejudice against working class candidates, but maybe there just aren't very many working class candidates out there who are up for the job. Maybe voters would love to vote for qualified blue collar workers, but maybe you're thinking, blue collar workers they're no good. They're not smart enough. White collar government is just sort of a necessary evil. We're making the best of the bad situation. Again, I would get offended, but then I would show you data. So a lot of people who make this argument, they point to sort of nationally representative surveys that political scientists have done. So these are data from the American National Election Study, which is a national survey that's done every 2 years since the 1950s. And what a lot of people will point me to is they'll point me to results like this one. So if you look at in the National Election Study, the people who say when they're surveyed, this is a survey of just regular Americans, nationally representative. If you look at the percentage of people who say that they follow public affairs most of the time, they're paying attention to politics, and you compare the percentage of white-collar professionals who say they do that to the percentage of blue-collar workers, well, hey, blue-collar workers are less likely to follow public affairs. They're also less likely to, people from the social group, if they're less likely than other social groups to be qualified, or if they're less likely to actually enter to actually throw their hat in the ring, or if they're less likely to win, if people from a given social group are disproportionately screened out at any of these stages, then they'll be underrepresented in our political institutions. And I think it's time we start paying closer attention to the candidate entry stage. I think there's good evidence that qualifications aren't what's screening working class people out, and there's good evidence that elections aren't screening working class people out. I think it's time we do the iPhone thing. We zoom in, right? We zoom in on the candidate entry stage and start to think seriously about why qualified working class people aren't running for political office. And the thing is, this is where the research in political science really stops. So there are two big questions that if we care about why working class people don't run for office, we've got to answer right off the bat. The first is this: we don't actually know how many working class people run for office. So political scientists and journalists and pundits, they tend to pay a lot of attention to who actually gets into office. So you'll see reports every Congress. This is the occupational makeup of Congress. This is the gender makeup of Congress. This is the racial makeup of Congress. Those are important things to talk about. But very few people will actually take a step back and say, well, what's the occupational or the gender or the racial makeup of the people who ran in that election? We tend not to pay a lot of attention to people who run and lose. And that sort of makes sense. The people who run and win are the ones who are making public policy. But if we care about why we're getting a certain mix of people winning, we've got to start paying attention to how many working class people are actually running in the first place. And assuming that working class people aren't running, assuming that the breakdown really is happening at the candidate entry stage, there are lots of qualified workers, but they aren't choosing to run, the next question we have to ask is, well, why? What's screening them out? And I think there are three possibilities. Political scientists know that people participate in politics for basically three reasons. Because they can, they want to, and someone asks them. Right? This is what it takes. If you get involved in politics, it's because you're able to, you want to, and it really helps if somebody encourages you to get involved. And that tends to be what predicts political engagement of all kinds. And so I think as we start to figure out why more working class people don't run for office, that's a logical place to start. Working class people, maybe they, even though they're qualified, they don't think they can run or win or govern. There's a confidence gap. Maybe working class people simply don't want to run, either because it's prohibitive, taking time off work is difficult, being able to afford lost income is difficult, and so it could be lots of working class people, they think they could run a great campaign, but they don't want to put themselves or their families in that kind of situation. And then the other possibility, which is the one that I want to focus on today, and the one that I think there's some really interesting evidence on, it could just be that working class people, they're qualified, they're confident, and if someone asks them, they run, but it could be there's a disconnect happening at what I call the candidate recruitment process. That's what I want to focus on today. Why candidate recruitment? Why am I interested in that? Well, the main reason is we know that candidate recruitment helps explain the shortage of other historically underrepresented groups in political office. So my friend Melody Crowdermeyer did a study. So she's interested in why there are so few women in office. And she did a survey where she surveyed the chair of every county level political party in the country. And she asked them, could a woman, what are the chances a woman could win an election in your county? And what a lot of them said on this survey was, I would love to run more female candidates, but they just couldn't win in my county. And so what Melody did was she actually matched those surveys up with real data on how female candidates performed in those counties. What she found is a lot of these county party chairs are flat wrong. They think that women would not perform well in elections, but in fact they are systematically underestimating the chances that a woman would win an election in their county. Maybe they just don't know, maybe they don't have a lot of experience with female candidates, but what Melody finds is that basically candidate recruitment isn't happening for women in a lot of counties because the people who are doing the recruiting, these gatekeepers, whether they're party leaders or interest group leaders, are just underestimating how great female candidates would do in those counties. And there are similar findings that sort of look at other populations. So some scholars have surveyed qualified women. They found women who would be, who have what it would take to be a great candidate, and then they've talked to men who have what it takes, would have sort of the exact same qualities. So two groups of people who are equally qualified, and what they find is that equally qualified women are actually less likely to report that they've been encouraged to run for office. So we're seeing the same sort of thing when we shift from talking to gatekeepers themselves to talking to sort of qualified people. Same story here. Women who are just as qualified as men are less likely to be encouraged to run for office. But when these same qualified women are recruited, are encouraged, they're more likely to run. So it looks like candidate recruitment is one of the major explanations for why we don't have enough women in office. I think it could help us explain the shortage of working class people in office too. Number one, it could be that sort of these gatekeepers or these candidate recruiters, whether they're party leaders or interest groups, they might similarly underestimate how well working class candidates would perform in elections. I mean, if they've been reading in defense of elitism, they might have gotten the wacky idea that voters don't like working class candidates. There's also an added complication for working class people, which is it may be that a lot of these gatekeepers just don't know a lot of blue collar workers. So it's true of everybody. We all tend to associate more with people who do similar jobs to what we do. And that's again, I'm not saying anyone's doing anything wrong here. I'm just saying it's a fact of life that if you're a lawyer and you're running a county level political party and you've got to find somebody to run for this open county commission seat, you're not going to do a survey of the entire county and find every qualified person and then draw a name out of a hat. Right? You're going to go to your own contact list and say, who do I know who's a reliable Republican? Oh, Steve, I know him from the law firm. And I think that's one potential mechanism. Gatekeepers, they might underestimate workers, but they might just not know many workers if they're not working class themselves. As a result, I think it's very likely that working class people are less likely to be encouraged than equally qualified white-collar Americans. And I think that if both of those things are true, then one of the ways we might get more working class people in political office is simply by more of the gatekeepers who encourage everyone to run for political office, simply making an active effort to recruit and train working class people. So that's why I want to study candidate recruitment. There's a big problem though. Why not study candidate recruitment? Because there's no data. So I mentioned I'm a quantitative political scientist. I need lots of ones and zeros to do anything. Before I open my mouth, I have to have some sort of data set. And there's no sort of off-the-shelf data that are really good for answering these questions. Surveys of political gatekeepers, like Melody Crowdermeyer's survey of county party leaders, are incredibly rare. It's a hard population to survey, and the few studies that have been done haven't really asked about social class. They've been interested in other questions. Likewise, there are lots of good surveys of ordinary citizens, but very few of those surveys ask, were you ever recruited to run for political office? That's just a really rare occurrence. If you know, took up a little bit of space on a public opinion survey for the question, have you ever been asked to run for public office? You might get 1% of people saying yes, and so you couldn't really learn very much from that question. And on top of that, we don't even have, at this point in time, good data on the social class makeup of the people who run. As I said a minute ago, political scientists focus on the winners of elections. So as it stands, studying candidate recruitment is hard because we don't even know who's running in the first place. To overcome these sorts of challenges, in 2012, I worked with a team of researchers, me at Duke, my co-PI Chris Scofrin, who's a PhD student at the University of Michigan, my co-PI David Brockman, who's a PhD student at Berkeley, and Melody Crowdermeyer, who's a professor at Sewanee, who ran the survey of party chairs that I mentioned a minute ago. And the four of us teamed up, and we ran a survey called the 2012 National Candidate Study, where we surveyed all 10,000 of the people running for state legislature nationwide. 13 of them complained. 12 directly contacted me either by phone or email. I have a background in customer service. All 12 of the people who contacted me both apologized for yelling at me and took the survey. The only one who didn't contact me directly wrote a letter to the Board of Trustees at Duke calling for me to be terminated. I was not terminated. I had IRB approval for the study. But the person also did not take the survey. But a total of 2,000 state legislative candidates nationwide did take the 2012 National Candidate Study. So we have a big pool of information about the experiences of actual state legislative candidates. We asked questions that we solicited from political scientists all over the country, ranging from, so two of my colleagues, David and Chris, were interested in what do politicians think their constituents think. So they asked what percentage of the people you represent or you're hoping to represent support universal health care. And then they went out and actually computed the percentage of people in that state legislative district who support universal health care. And they found that politicians think their constituents, liberal and conservative politicians, think their constituents are more conservative than they really are. So politicians are miscalculating what their constituents think. We also asked questions about what makes running for office easy, what makes running for office hard. And then we asked some questions that I was especially interested in, like who's running for office, what's the racial and social class and gender makeup of this pool of candidates. And sort of relevant to this question, who's being encouraged to run? Of the people who are running for office, are there differences in who's getting encouragement and support, who's being told you should run? And that's going to help us answer both of the questions that I'm interested in today, both just first of all, the purely descriptive point, are working class people actually running for office, or are they really being screened out before voters even get a chance to weigh in on them? And second, if they are running, can we find out anything, are they being encouraged, or is it really the case that they're less likely to be encouraged to run? So on the first question, how many working class Americans actually run for office? This was exciting to me when we finally got the data back, and for the first time ever. So we asked a question on the survey. We just asked directly, what do you do for a living, essentially? What's your primary occupation? We let people describe their jobs in their own words. Then I went through and coded those occupations up and tabulated the percentage of state legislative candidates nationwide who do manual labor or service industry jobs. Now we know in the whole population, about 54% of Americans have manual labor or service industry jobs. So the question I asked is, well, what percentage of candidates? Anyone want to take a guess? Closest without going over Price is Right rules? Any guesses?
10.
10. 15. 4. You have to take one more. You have to have 4 entries. Price is Right rules. 10, 15, 4, 20. That sound means you're all over. 3. So if this were really the Price is Right, you'd all have to guess again. But yeah, 54% of Americans have working class jobs. 3% of state legislative candidates nationwide have working class jobs. And then of the people who win state leg races, 2% nationwide have working class jobs. So this is just saying, yeah, all of the screening out is happening not at elections. It's not lots of working people are running and the voters are just sending them home. It's actually the case that working class people aren't running in the first place. Working class Americans rarely hold office because they rarely run. So the answer to my question is yeah, how many working class Americans actually run for office? Very few. What is this telling us? Why do we care? This is basically saying to me, I think, that if you want to explain why there are so few working class people in political office, the candidate entry stage is really, to paraphrase Vice President Biden on the occasion of the passage of the Affordable Care Act, it's a big freaking deal. Candidate entry is really where the action is in terms of working class people being screened out of the political process.
Your previous slide there, which before that of those who run, they do rather well in the elections.
Yeah. Those who run, there's actually, they tend to have essentially a 50-50 shot away. So these numbers I'm rounding here, but the 3 and the 2 are very similar. So yeah, of the ones who run, it's not like they're running 3% of candidates and 0% of winners. They tend to hold their own in elections. Yeah, absolutely. So the other question I want to ask is, well, why don't more working class people run? And with this survey, we can actually test the hypothesis that they're less likely to be encouraged to run. So on the survey, we asked a couple of questions. We basically said, who encouraged you to run the first time you ran, whether that's this election or some previous election? Who encouraged you to run and who discouraged you from running? And then we gave them all these different options. some of which were sort of gatekeepers, so interest groups, some of which were more personal, or interested in sort of other questions, so you're members of your family or employer. We didn't find that candidates were terribly willing to tell us that they had been discouraged from running for office, so candidates weren't really willing to say, yeah, lots of people told me not to run. But candidates were candid with us in telling us, they gave us lots of different answers about the combinations of people who encouraged them to run. And what we basically found is that candidates from the working class reported they were less likely to have been encouraged by key political gatekeepers. So if you look at, say, the percentage of candidates from different occupations who said, someone from an interest group, either national or state or local, someone from an interest group encouraged me to run for political office. If you break down the candidates in our survey by occupation, working class candidates are dead last. So these are sort of the other occupations that I was showing you in my earlier slides. And yeah, working class candidates were the least likely of any occupational or social class group, the least likely to have been encouraged to run by an interest group. They're also the least likely to have been encouraged to run by a politician, by a sitting politician or some other active civic leader. They were least likely to have been encouraged to run by a member of the media. The one exception was party leaders. Working class people were sort of at the top, or basically indistinguishable. What I think is that basically anyone who's going to run, almost everyone who runs for political office, you've got to have the encouragement of the party leader. Most people don't run for office unless someone in the party leadership says, yeah, you'd be a good political candidate. But if you just add up sort of the total number of different gatekeepers who are doing encouraging here, candidates from the working class are dead last, even though, and this is something else we can see with the survey, the working class candidates in this study were just as qualified in the ways we can measure as all the other candidates. They're getting less encouragement than anyone else, but on objective measures that we have of their qualifications, they don't really stand out. They're actually pretty unremarkable. So on the survey, we asked a few questions. One was just, have you ever held any of different types of offices before? We also asked them about what are they seriously concerned about when they ran for office for the first time. And so we sort of got a picture of, A, who's actually held office before. That's a really good measure of whether somebody's sort of a high-quality candidate. That's something political scientists often use as sort of proxy for, are you a good candidate? And we can also see, are you the type of person who's confident that you're going to win this election, or are you the type of person who you think you're a long shot? And when I looked at these data, working class people just didn't stand out. So they were sort of towards the bottom on the percentage who have ever held office before, but they weren't dead last, and they were pretty similar to a lot of other occupational groups. When I added up the number of things people were not concerned about, so we asked, were you seriously worried about your ability to run a campaign, win an election, or actually do the job if you get elected? So on this measure, a 0 is, no, I can't do any of these things. I'm not going to run a good campaign or win the race or do a good job when I get into office. And no one gives that answer on a survey like this. We also found very few people who, we missed confidence. Confidence isn't showing up. Well, suffice it to say, if I had showed you confidence, what that graph ends up looking like is basically like this one. Working class people are sort of in the middle. They're not any more confident. Everybody scores a 2 is sort of the interesting finding from our measure. Every occupational group, basically most candidates are seriously worried about one of these things. And that sort of reflects the fact, yeah, running for office, holding for office is really tough. But you don't do it unless you think you've got a real shot. But no one who's running for office, well, you hope. You wouldn't want to meet the person who says, yeah, I've got this campaign in the bag, I'm going to win the election, I'm going to be great. Our candidates expressed some concerns, and working class people didn't stand out. We also asked, how many of you are worried about fundraising, your ability to raise enough money? Working class people sort of scored right in the middle. Everybody's worried about fundraising. Whether you're a lawyer, a business owner, or a worker, everyone knows that you have to raise more money than ever, so everyone's worried about fundraising. working class people were among the most confident in their ability or were scored really high on a measure of sort of, are you worried about losing your job or losing income? Again, we see lots of people are worried about losing their job, losing income. Working class people don't look remarkable in this respect. And actually, the one measure that was really interesting to me was we asked, are you worried about just giving up your free time to run for political office? Working class candidates were the most willing of any occupational group to give up their free time with friends, in order to run for political office. So what we basically see is working class candidates in our survey look about as qualified as candidates from any other occupational background. But again, they are the least likely to report that they were encouraged to run by a political gatekeeper. And I want to mention, these are the workers who ran. If gatekeepers are less likely to, if these candidates are saying, I'm not getting encouragement to run, and these are the people who are running and winning in our elections, how much less encouragement are the working class people who chose not to run getting? And my guess is that the disparity is even greater there. I think, why don't more working class people run for office? Is it that no one asked them? I think it looks that way. And this data set isn't the only source of evidence along those lines. So what I think this shows is, yeah, working class people may be less likely to be encouraged to run for office. That's what we're hearing. When we talk to working class people who do run, they report that they're less likely to be encouraged. We also see, though, in other data sets, some evidence that working class people, that in places where working class people are in situations where they can be recruited to run for office, they are holding office at higher rates. So one data set that I've looked at, which is a combination of data collected by the Insurance Information Institute and the National Conference of State Legislatures. And what we have from them is the percentage of the state legislature that had working class jobs at historically coincidental 15-year intervals, 1979, 1994, and 2009. And what we find when we look at those data is that states where unions are stronger or where workers make up greater shares of the party volunteers within the state. So basically, in states where working class people are more closely connected to interest groups and parties, to these gatekeepers, more working class people wind up in the state legislature. There's a statistically significant relationship between states that have a higher union density and the percentage of working class people that wind up in the legislature. There's a statistically significant relationship between the percentage of campaign or party staff in the state who are working class and the percentage of working class people who wind up in the legislature. And to me, that says that, yeah, when working class people are connected to gatekeepers, when they're in these positions where they're, in the world of these recruiters, in the world of these gatekeepers, we do see more of them getting into political office. Of course, it would be really nice to have a sort of more detailed look at what's going on with the gatekeepers themselves. So we can see, with the 2012 National Candidate Study, what's going on in the heads of political candidates. It'd be really nice to know what's going on in the heads of political gatekeepers, too. So later this month, we're going to field the sister survey. The 2012 National Candidate Study was, I think, a big success. So later this month, we'll be fielding the 2013 National Survey of Party Leaders. So the chair of every county level political party in the country is going to be getting a letter from me and my co-PIs, asking them questions about how they recruit candidates, about why they do or don't recruit female candidates, about why they do or don't recruit candidates from the working class. And so we should be able to get, by the end of the calendar year, we should have a clearer picture of whether gatekeepers, whether they know lots of working class people, whether they underestimate how well working class people will perform elections. I'm also doing some new research to actually see whether if we recruit working class people to run for office, by we, I mean, if researchers actually do this in the context of a randomized field experiment, can we actually show, can we measure the effects of recruiting working class people to run for political office? And so right now I'm sort of working with some groups that are running field experiments right now. They're in the business of recruiting political candidates. I would like to tell you about those studies, but and this is the only time I get to use this. They are still top secret. These are in the field right now, and if I told you about the studies that we're running to recruit working class candidates, and you went back and told candidates, it could actually contaminate the study. And this is the only time in my career I ever get to sort of mark something confidential. So I'll just say that by the end of the calendar year, I'll also be able to tell you, dollar for dollar, what the effect is of spending on direct mailers and emails and phone banks and face-to-face contact. Literally, how much you have to spend or how much work you have to put in order to encourage working class people to run for office. Until then, top secret. Don't even ask. So my hope is that we can really start to do an even better job of answering the question of why don't more working class people run, and really get a handle on the importance of who's doing the asking. There's also these other two explanations, which I've kind of just bracketed during this talk, that I think deserve some more attention. It could be that there are lots of qualified workers out there who don't think that they're qualified, who underestimate themselves. Or it could be there are lots of qualified working class people out there who don't want to run, either because it's too much of a personal burden, or because they don't see it as a rewarding career. I mean, politics, especially with what's happening in Washington this week, there are lots of people who are looking at politics and saying, that's not for me, that's not how I want to spend my life. And so it could be that each of these explanations has some merit. What we would really need to test those is a national survey of politically qualified people. So what would be nice, and this does not exist, this is just me having some fun with PowerPoint. What would be nice is to do a national survey of people who have sort of the basic qualifications we would want in a political candidate. Now, the obvious challenge there is, what does it actually mean to be qualified to be a political candidate? I could ask everybody in this room, and you would probably all give me a slightly different. I don't think any two of us would say exactly the same thing about what we look for in a political candidate. But what we've done is we've built into this national survey of party chairs questions that ask them, what does your ideal candidate look like? What does a person need to win an election, to hold office? And so we've asked them a whole series of questions that get at what does it mean to be qualified. So we'll have some sort of starting point for research on what do politically qualified citizens think. Are working class citizens, A, can we identify qualified working class citizens, and B, are they less interested in running, are they less confident in their ability to succeed, even if they're equally qualified. And so I hope that sometime in the next year or two we're able to actually do a survey of qualified citizens so that we can get a sort of more precise answer to this question of why don't more working class people run. But I should mention, no one needs to wait around for academic researchers like me to sort of answer these empirical questions, because there are already groups on the ground that are sort of taking it, taking the idea that we need to start recruiting more working class people to run for political office and implementing programs that do exactly that. So in New Jersey, and this is what's really exciting me about this research agenda, this is not like some academic pipe dream that, maybe 50 years from now someone will use this research. My hope is that there are programs on the ground right now that are trying to do exactly what I'm describing. In New Jersey, the AFL-CIO has run a candidate recruitment and training program for working class people since the mid-1990s. They run it on what's the equivalent of a shoestring budget in New Jersey. So they have a budget of about $500,000. A lot of money to you and me, but in New Jersey politics money, that's less than 1% of what John Corzine spent to run for the U.S. Senate for the first time. So they're operating on, in New Jersey terms, a very small budget. They have the graduates of the New Jersey AFL-CIO labor candidates who have a 75% win rate in elections. Graduates of this program serve at every level of the state government, from local offices all the way up to the state legislature. And so what we're seeing is, when you reach out to working class people who are politically qualified, when you encourage them to run, when you help them overcome the practical barriers, help them negotiate time off work from their employers, and then give them the exact same training that everyone who runs for political office gets when they first decide to throw their hat in the ring, works beautifully. It doesn't cost that much, again, in New Jersey political terms, it doesn't cost that much, and the end result is a really high success rate. And models like this are starting to spread all over the country. So a few weeks ago, I went to the Nevada State AFL-CIO, which has been running a campaign boot camp for working class people for the last few years. In Oregon, they just launched, this is the second year that Oregon, Coalition of Unions in Oregon, will be running a labor candidate school. I found out 2 nights ago that Maine has run for now 2 years, and the Maine AFL-CIO has a labor candidate school. The California AFL-CIO has a labor candidate school. And to me, this is really exciting stuff. And of course, maybe you probably know in New Haven, this model was even taken down to the city level. So in New Haven, a really anti-union mayor was elected, and so a coalition of unions unite here, got together and recruited, trained, and supported a whole slate of I think it was 17 union candidates. 16 of them won. The Board of Aldermen, the city government in New Haven, overnight became majority working class. And as a result, when the mayor handed down a bill that said we're going to gut public sector unions, it was an easy nay vote for the city council. And to me, these are the types of programs that are really exciting. My hope is that the kind of research I'm doing can help show more people the value of doing programs like this, and maybe even help the activists who are doing this work on the ground figure out how to more effectively support and train qualified candidates from the working class. My hope, my ambition is that this kind of research can really be useful, not just for sort of satisfying, not just for answering our academic questions, but also for making a difference. My hope is that sort of by the time this guy is old enough to run for president, that white-collar government won't be listed under studies in American politics. I want white-collar government to be American history. So thanks very much for having me here, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.